At some point, games didn't just get easier, they stopped being allowed to let you fail. Life counters disappeared, checkpoints got closer, progress became harder to lose. And the explanation sounds simple. Games got more accessible, more welcoming, more fun. But that explanation hides what actually happened, because failure didn't just fade out, it was removed. And once you see why, you can't unsee it. Because the moment games stopped being allowed to let you fail, it stopped being by design. It became survival. The usual explanation sounds like this: games reached a wider audience, so developers made them easier to understand, better tutorials, smoother difficulty, less frustration. And on the surface, that looks like progress. When failure starts disappearing, it feels like design getting better. But it wasn't. Because that explanation assumes this was a choice, that developers decided games should feel better to play. They didn't. Something changed underneath the industry that made failure impossible to justify at all. That explanation breaks the moment you look at how older games actually worked. Failure wasn't just part of the experience, it was the glue holding the experience together. Take Super Mario Bros., for example. Once you lose all your lives, you start over. In arcade games, every failure costs you another quarter. Limited lives, full restarts, repeating the same sections again and again. Now, this wasn't because developers didn't know better. It was because most of these games only had a few hours of actual content. Failure is what made them feel longer. It's what made them feel complete. Failure created tension, it created stakes, and more importantly, it created value. Failure wasn't punishment, it was the product. But only if the game actually felt good to play. Otherwise, it just felt cheap. In a genuinely good and challenging game, the more you failed, the more time you spent with the game, the more the game justified its existence. Now, remove that, and something else disappears with it. Imagine paying $60 for a game, getting stuck, and giving up halfway through. You don't think, oh wow, this is a good challenge. You think, I just paid $60 to replay the same 3 levels over and over again. You see, that's the shift. Failure didn't just raise difficulty, it controlled how much of the game you actually saw. And if it blocks you from seeing the entire game, let me ask you, does that $60 still feel worth it to you? So if failure used to be the thing that gave a game value, what do you replace it with? The answer is completion. If players don't finish a game, it doesn't feel worth it. And you can see that in the data. In some major releases, fewer than 40% of players ever reach the ending. That means more than half your audience never sees what you built. It's like paying for a movie and checking out halfway through. You don't think that was a great experience, you think, cool, I paid for half a story. Now, apply that same logic to a game. Every time a player dies, gets stuck, or has to repeat something, there's a moment where they can check out. And most of the time, that's exactly when they do. So failure stops being a challenge and becomes a risk, not to the player, but to the game. And you can see design adapting to that. A very good early example is Halo. Your shields regenerate automatically. A mechanic that was once used to test endurance now actually stabilizes you. Uncharted is another good example. In that series, checkpoints are constant. The game doesn't test if you can recover. It makes sure you don't have to. Because the goal isn't to push you backward anymore, it's to keep you moving forward. And then the pressure multiplied. Because in the late 90s, many games cost a few $1,000,000 to make. But by the mid to late 2000s, that jumps to tens of millions. But the price of the game doesn't necessarily scale with it. So now you have a gap. Costs explode, but revenue stays fixed. And that means there's only one way to protect the investment. Make sure players see the content and feel the value. Because every level, every mechanic, every cutscene isn't just design anymore. It's cost. Hundreds of developers, years of production, millions of dollars. And all of it only matters if the player actually sees it. It's like building a massive theme park with state-of-the-art rides where most visitors try the first ride, get frustrated at the long lines, and leave. At that point, the problem isn't quality, it's exposure. So for gaming, the question changes. It's not, can the player overcome this, but how do we make sure they don't give up? And that's where everything clicks. Checkpoints, regenerating health, constant forward momentum. These aren't just conveniences, they're safeguards. They reduce the cost of failure. They turn mistakes into delays instead of exits. Because if failure leads to frustration, and frustration leads to quitting, then failure becomes something you can't afford to build around anymore. Not because players changed, because the business did. And once that shift starts, it doesn't stop. So the next question is, when did this become impossible for the industry to avoid? So when did this become impossible to avoid? There isn't a single moment where everything changes, but there is a point where it stopped being optional. The pressure started building in the sixth generation. The PS2, GameCube, and original Xbox totaled over 200 million units sold worldwide. Games were no longer made for a specific type of player. They were made for everyone. And that changed how games had to be built. You couldn't just assume that players knew what they were doing. You had to assume everyone came in at a different skill level. But the real break came in the mid-2000s when the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 arrived. Everything started to scale rapidly. Budgets spiked, teams grew into the hundreds, and games became packed with expensive content, voice acting, cinematics, massive environments. Series like Uncharted or Call of Duty weren't just games anymore. They were experiences, and those experiences only work if players actually see them. Now, failure doesn't just slow players down, it blocks access to the product itself. At that point, letting players fail isn't just risky, it starts costing you money. So the industry locked into a new rule: progress must be preserved. Failure can exist, but it can't push players out. And once that became the baseline, it didn't reverse. But where does that leave players who still want a challenge? Once that shift locked in, you started to see it everywhere, but not in the way most people think. Difficulty didn't disappear, it just got pushed out. Instead of being part of the main experience, it moved to the edges. Optional modes, harder difficulty settings, post-game challenges. It's still there, just not where it used to be, and most players never touch it. Like those collectibles you swear you'll come back for, or that 100% completion you tell yourself you'll go for later. You don't. And Souls-like games don't break the system. They prove it, because they exist in a separate space where failure is still allowed to matter. But for most games, the real version becomes the one you can finish. And that changes what the game is asking from you. It's no longer testing whether you can overcome something. It's making sure you keep going. You're guided forward. You're kept in the experience. You're pushed toward the ending. Because if you don't see the content, it might as well not exist. So challenge becomes optional, and progress becomes expected, which means the core question changes. It's no longer, can you do this? It's, how long until you do? That's a completely different kind of game. It's not about getting better, it's about not dropping off. So, if that's the system now, what did we trade away? Games didn't get easier. They were rebuilt around one constraint: you have to finish. Because if you don't, it doesn't feel worth it. And if it doesn't feel worth it, everything behind it starts to fall apart. So failure couldn't stay what it was. It couldn't block progress. It couldn't push you out. It couldn't risk you walking away. Not because players demanded it, because the industry couldn't afford anything else. Which means what feels like accessibility, what feels like the game respecting your time, is actually something more specific. A system built to keep you moving, not to test you, but to make sure you don't leave. So the next time a game lets you keep going, ask yourself, is it really helping me? Or is it actually holding you back? So now I want to know what you think. Do you prefer a game that helps you along, or do you like one that challenges you at every turn? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.